In the picturesque town of Pinewood Hills, one home held a horrifying secret, an invisible force that turned love into fear, whispers into screams, and a perfect marriage into a gruesome nightmare. Behind closed doors, the truth wasn't just hidden, it was alive. Pinewood Hills was the kind of neighborhood where life seemed serene and predictable. Lush lawns framed pristine homes, and families strolled down its tree-lined streets, exchanging polite smiles. Among its residents, Claire and David Monroe stood out. Claire's kindness as an elementary school teacher earned her the admiration of parents and students alike, while David's success as an architect afforded them the means to host elegant garden parties that neighbors anticipated every summer. Together, they painted a flawless picture of love and prosperity. Yet beneath this polished exterior, an unsettling aura lingered around the Monroes. Neighbors occasionally remarked on the overly manicured appearance of their home, joking that it seemed too perfect. Friends noticed how Claire's laughter sometimes seemed forced, as though concealing an invisible weight. And then there were the odd occurrences. Claire would subtly mention a misplaced item here, a faint sound there. Though she often laughed it off, those close to her wondered if the couple's picture-perfect life harbored an undercurrent of tension. Claire had recently confided to her best friend, Jessica, that she felt watched even when she was alone. "Sometimes it's like there's a shadow," she whispered during one of their coffee chats, her eyes darting nervously to the window. Jessica dismissed it as paranoia, a product of stress from Claire's increasing workload. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling, especially when she started finding her belongings in strange places: her wedding ring on the kitchen counter when she swore she'd left it on the nightstand, or her favorite book lying open to a page she hadn't read yet. David, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Claire's unease. His work demanded long hours, and when he was home he seemed distracted, staring blankly at his phone or losing himself in his architectural sketches. Claire attributed his distance to the pressures of his career, but the growing silence between them felt suffocating. At night, as Claire lay in bed, she swore she could hear faint whispers, indistinct murmurs that stopped as soon as she strained to listen. Then came the night she saw it. Standing by the window, she caught a glimpse of movement in the backyard, a fleeting shadow that darted out of sight when she turned on the porch light. She told David, but he dismissed her concerns with a tired shrug. "It's probably a raccoon or something," he said, not even looking up from his tablet. Claire's unease deepened, but she didn't press the issue. She had no idea how close the shadow would come. The chilling events of October 14th began like any other evening. The autumn air was crisp, and the Monroes' home glowed with the warm light of their living room lamp. Claire planned to curl up with her latest novel, a habit that gave her solace in recent weeks. David had texted earlier, saying he'd be working late, leaving Claire alone in their large, silent house. Around 9 p.m., she felt it again, that peculiar sense of being watched. The feeling was stronger this time, suffocating. Claire closed her book and glanced toward the window, her heart skipping a beat as she thought she saw movement beyond the sheer curtains. Steeling her nerves, she approached the glass, but there was nothing there. Minutes passed, and Claire convinced herself it was her imagination. She settled back into her chair, trying to shake off the tension. That's when she heard the sound, a faint creak, like a floorboard groaning under someone's weight. Her blood ran cold. The noise had come from upstairs. "David," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Claire grabbed her phone and dialed David, but the call went straight to voicemail. She told herself it was nothing, probably just the house settling. Yet her pulse quickened as she climbed the stairs, each step amplifying the silence around her. She stopped outside their bedroom, hesitating before pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong, thicker, colder, as though it were alive with something unseen. And then she saw it, the faint imprint of muddy footprints leading from the window to the hallway. Panic surged through her as she backed away, her breathing rapid. She spun around, only to come face to face with nothingness, just the yawning darkness of the empty hall. Claire dashed downstairs, locking the door behind her, her fingers trembling as she tried to call David again. At that moment she heard it, a soft, guttural whisper. It was indistinct, but it was there, unmistakable, coming from the living room. Frozen with fear, Claire slowly turned her head toward the sound. She could see the shadow now, no longer fleeting, no longer hiding. It loomed just beyond the edge of the light, its form twisting unnaturally as it stepped closer. The last thing Claire remembered was the cold grip of terror as she screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness around her. By the time the neighbors heard the faint echo of her cry and called the police, it was too late. When David arrived home to find the house surrounded by flashing lights, his face contorted with shock and grief as officers informed him of Claire's gruesome fate, but something in his reaction seemed off. As they led him inside to identify her body, one of the officers caught a fleeting smirk, a detail that wouldn't come to light until much later. Unbeknownst to the neighbors and police, the shadows of Pinewood Hills held secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. The investigation into Claire Monroe's brutal murder shook Pinewood Hills to its core. It wasn't just the shocking violence that left the community reeling, it was the lack of answers. As investigators pored over the scene, they found puzzling clues. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of theft, and nothing that suggested an outsider had broken into the meticulously maintained Monroe home. To everyone else, this pointed to someone close to Claire. To the police, it pointed to David. David Monroe became their primary suspect almost immediately. His alibi, that he was working late at his downtown office, began to crumble under scrutiny. Security cameras outside his building showed him leaving 2 hours before the estimated time of death. When pressed, David claimed he had gone to a diner to clear his head, but no receipts or witnesses could corroborate this. Meanwhile, a search of David's car unearthed something far more damning, a pair of leather gloves with faint, rusty red stains. But the gloves weren't the only thing raising alarm. In the days leading up to her death, Claire had made several purchases that now seemed significant: a small hidden camera, motion detectors, and a journal. In the journal, she had written cryptic entries about her unease, describing the sounds, the shadows, and the unsettling feeling that someone or something was always watching. "I see it at night," read one particularly haunting entry. "It stays just outside the light. I told David, but he says it's my imagination. Maybe he's right. But it feels real." When the police reviewed the footage from Claire's hidden camera, they found something chilling. On the night of her murder, the camera captured her pacing the living room, visibly agitated. She would occasionally glance toward the hallway, her face pale with fear. Then, at exactly 9:42 p.m., the camera glitched. The screen went black for 7 seconds. When the footage resumed, Claire was no longer in frame. All that could be seen was the faint sway of the curtains, as if something had moved past them. Adding to the mystery, forensic analysis of the bloody gloves revealed an anomaly. While the majority of the blood matched Claire, there were faint traces of another sample, a match for someone entirely unexpected: Leo Barnes, a local handyman who had worked for the Monroes months earlier. Leo was no stranger to the police. He had a history of petty thefts and a short stint in jail for assault. When officers brought him in for questioning, his demeanor was defiant. He admitted to working at the Monroe house but denied ever being inside it recently. "I haven't set foot near that place in months," he spat. Yet investigators couldn't ignore the DNA evidence, nor could they explain why Leo's fingerprints were found on the back gate, prints that hadn't been there during routine maintenance checks a week earlier. The deeper they dug, the stranger the case became. Witnesses reported seeing Leo near the neighborhood on the night of the murder, yet his alibi was airtight. Meanwhile, neighbors began to whisper about the Monroe house itself. Some claimed to have heard strange noises emanating from it at night, while others swore they had seen shadows moving behind its windows when no one was home. As investigators scrambled to piece together the puzzle, the case took an even darker turn. A second review of Claire's journal revealed a horrifying detail that had been missed. Claire wasn't just afraid of someone watching her. She believed something was living in the house. "There's something wrong here," one entry read. "It's not just the shadows or the noises. It's in the walls. Sometimes, I think I hear it breathing." At first, detectives dismissed these entries as the ramblings of a paranoid woman. But then a construction team hired to inspect the house made a startling discovery. Hidden behind the drywall in the attic was a small, makeshift room. Inside were discarded food wrappers, a stained mattress, and what appeared to be a crude shrine, a collection of photos, trinkets, and locks of hair that all belonged to Claire. The evidence pointed squarely back to Leo. His prints were on some of the items in the shrine, and the shrine's existence seemed to confirm Claire's worst fears: she had been stalked. But the question remained, why? If Leo had been living in their attic, why hadn't Claire or David noticed sooner? And more importantly, did this mean Leo was the killer? Leo vehemently denied any involvement. His alibi for the night of the murder remained solid, and while the shrine implicated him as a stalker, it didn't prove he had killed Claire. Frustrated, investigators began to consider other possibilities. That's when they found the bloodied knife. Discovered hidden under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, the knife had David's fingerprints all over it. The evidence painted a damning picture, yet David maintained his innocence. He claimed he had never seen the knife before and suggested it had been planted to frame him. But then the whispers began. Officers stationed at the house during the investigation started reporting strange occurrences: doors slamming on their own, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and the faint sound of whispers echoing through the halls. One officer claimed to see a shadow dart across the living room, only to find nothing there. The final blow came when forensic experts reviewed the hidden camera footage one last time. By enhancing the video, they discovered something horrifying in the seconds before the blackout. A dark, elongated figure, inhuman in shape, lurched toward Claire just as the footage cut out. Leo was charged with stalking and trespassing, but the murder case was left unresolved. David was released due to lack of evidence, but the once proud architect left Pinewood Hills, unable to escape the stain of suspicion. The Monroe house was eventually abandoned, and the neighbors gave it a wide berth. Some say the house still stands as a silent witness to unspeakable horrors. Others whisper that Claire's killer or whatever had haunted her never truly left. And every so often, passers-by report seeing shadows moving behind the curtains, long after the house should have been empty. Months passed, and the murder of Claire Monroe seemed destined to become one of Pinewood Hills' darkest, unsolved mysteries. The community tried to move on, but whispers of the tragedy lingered. The Monroe house sat empty, its windows darkened like soulless eyes. Children dared each other to approach it, claiming they could hear faint whispers through the walls. Adults avoided the subject altogether, unwilling to confront the sinister enigma that had invaded their idyllic neighborhood. The police had all but closed the case. Leo Barnes had been imprisoned for stalking, yet doubts about his involvement in the murder persisted. David Monroe, once the golden boy of Pinewood Hills, had fled the town under the cloud of suspicion, though nothing definitively tied him to the crime. But Claire's story wasn't over. One frigid December night, Detective Rachel Harris, the lead investigator, found herself drawn back to the Monroe house. She had always been pragmatic, known for her logical approach, yet something about this case had unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the strange gaps in the evidence, or the eerie accounts of shadows and whispers. Or maybe it was the nagging sense that they had missed something, a vital clue hidden in the darkness. Armed with a flashlight and her determination, Rachel stepped into the house. The air was heavy and cold, even colder than the winter chill outside. Her breath misted in the beam of her flashlight as she moved through the living room, the scene of Claire's final moments. Though the house had been thoroughly searched before, Rachel's instincts told her to look again. She started in the living room, tracing the path of Claire's hidden camera. The eerie stillness of the space made her skin crawl. As she reviewed the footage again in her mind, something clicked. The glitch. The 7-second blackout had always been dismissed as a technical failure, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate. She examined the walls closely, her flashlight catching faint scuffs along the baseboard's marks that hadn't been there during the initial investigation. Slowly, she followed the trail, which led to the hallway. Rachel's heart raced as she stopped before a section of the wall that seemed oddly out of place. The wallpaper was slightly misaligned, as though it had been hastily reapplied. Using a crowbar she had brought with her, Rachel pried at the wall. With a groan, the panel came loose, revealing a narrow crawlspace. The stench of decay hit her immediately, and she gagged, pulling her scarf over her nose. Shining her flashlight into the opening, she froze. Inside the crawlspace were more of Claire's belongings, photographs, clothing, and what looked like strands of her hair. But it was the crude carvings on the walls that sent shivers down Rachel's spine. Words like mine, watching, and forever were etched in jagged letters, alongside crude drawings of Claire's face distorted into a grotesque grin. At the far end of the crawlspace, Rachel's beam caught something else, a journal. Trembling, she reached for it, flipping through its pages. To her shock, the handwriting didn't belong to Claire, it belonged to David. The entries revealed a horrifying truth. David had known about the shadows. He had seen them, felt their presence. In his writing, he described a force in the house, something that had attached itself to Claire. At first he thought it was his imagination, but as time passed he realized it wasn't. He wrote of waking up in the middle of the night to see Claire standing at the foot of their bed, staring at him with vacant eyes, her lips moving silently as though reciting something. One entry chilled Rachel to her core. It's not Claire anymore. It has her. And it wants me next. I can't let it. I have to end this. Even if it means ending her, the realization hit Rachel like a freight train. David had killed Claire not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear of the entity that had consumed her. But as she read further, the entries became more disjointed, more deranged. David's final words were scrawled in frantic, shaky handwriting. It's still here. It won't let me go. It's always watching. Always waiting. Before Rachel could process the full implications, the flashlight flickered. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a presence behind her. Slowly she turned, her breath catching in her throat. In the dim light, a shadow began to take form, its edges shifting and writhing like smoke. It was tall and impossibly thin, its hollow eyes boring into her. And then she heard it, the same faint whisper Claire had described in her journal. It wasn't a sound meant for ears, it was a voice that scraped against the edges of the mind. Rachel dropped the journal and bolted, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. As she stumbled out of the house, she swore she heard laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. The Monroe house was boarded up after that night, declared a danger zone, and left to decay. Rachel never spoke of what she found, but she left the force soon after, her once steely demeanor replaced by a haunted, vacant look. Over time, the story of Claire's murder became a local legend, blending fact and fiction. Some claimed David had returned to the house and was never seen again. Others whispered that the entity still lingered, waiting for its next victim. And every so often, late at night, passers-by swore they could see a figure standing in the upstairs window, its hollow eyes staring into the dark.